Well, good evening. I'm Charlie Copeland, and I'm the president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. In a minute, you'll hear from Cherie Harder, president of the Trinity Forum, and I'm honored that we are jointly hosting this program this evening. Members of the ISI community believe in a simple axiom, and that is think, live free. Think, live free. The Trinity Forum believes that the distraction, incivility, polarization, and pathology of our age stems in part from the lack of spiritual and character formation in leaders. There are few opportunities to grapple with, reflect on, and discuss fully what matters most. In other words, both organizations believe deeply that an informed citizenry, that informed leaders are well-read, intellectually curious, and deep thinking. At ISI, we build, grow, and maintain a community of college-related constituents, students, faculty, our alumni, who want to discuss and engage in the big ideas. What makes a society flourish and prosper? What makes a person whole? Why does a society in which the rules are above the rulers make a difference? ISI specifically focuses on higher education. Last year, we had over 1,250 faculty-advised student meetings, which equals over 30,000 deep educational interactions between our faculty and our students. We had 155 separate independent lectures and debates. We had 6 regional weekend conferences. We had 6 Liberty Fund-related conferences, 60 student newspapers that accessed over thousands of students, as well as made national news on shows like Tucker Carlson, USA Today, National Review, Dallas Morning News, and numerous others. And our honors conference, our summer honors conference, is considered the gold standard in developing conservative intellectual thought among college students, a de facto minor in conservatism, where we discuss Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, Hayek's Road to Serfdom, Richard Weaver's Ideas of Consequences, among other titles. The purpose of all these activities is to take today's college intellectual leaders and allow them to develop their own perspectives around these foundational ideas and how they can be applied today. I'm fond of saying, for instance, if poverty were easy to solve, we would have solved it already. The principles that drove the success of the Western world and brought the rest of the world along with it have been the most successful ideas at addressing those fundamental, intractable problems like poverty. However, the problems suffered by humans and by humanity are constantly shifting. Foundational ideas need constant sharpening and review, and discussions like this evening's are just a step in that ongoing process. On your chairs, you'll see a promotional handout for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute upcoming Dinner for Western Civilization, to be held in Washington, D.C. on Thursday, October the 15th. Early that afternoon, we're also hosting a forum on freedom where we will discuss the freedoms that drove the success of the Western world, and indeed America. And I do hope that you will be able to come. And if not, I hope that you will consider supporting ISI in any way that you can. As I said, we're on the college and university space, and it is an unfriendly, uncaring place for those who don't wholeheartedly buy into the identity politics of the current age. We directly confront this maelstrom and support the extremely bright young leaders who have the audacity to question campus dogma. You can help ensure that we develop the next generation of conservative leader. In short, you can help save America. You can help save the West, and indeed, you can help save the world. And that's not bad for a day's work, huh? So with that, I would like to introduce Cherie Harder, president of the Trinity Forum. Prior to joining the Trinity Forum in 2008, Ms. Harder served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President and Director of Policy and Projects for First Lady Laura Bush. Earlier in her career, she served as policy advisor to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, advising the leader on domestic social issues and serving as the liaison and outreach director to outside groups. From 2001 to 2005, she was the senior counselor to the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, where she helped the chairman design and launch the We the People initiative to enhance the teaching, study, and understanding of American history. Cherie?
Well, thank you, Charlie, for that kind introduction, and welcome to all of you to tonight's evening conversation on identity and dignity. On behalf of all of us at the Trinity Forum, it's a real pleasure and an honor to get to partner with you, and just so appreciate all the work that you've done, Charlie, and you, Josh, as well, to help make this a reality. We're also grateful for the support for tonight's event from the Democracy Fund, which invests in efforts to ensure that our political system is able to withstand new challenges and deliver on its promise to the American people. And we're delighted that their president, Joe Goldman, has joined us tonight, along with several members of the Democracy Fund staff, including Margaret Yao, Laura Maristani, Paul Waters, Liz Royde, Valerio Martinelli, Jessica Harris, and Donata Secondo. Thanks so much for joining us. I also want to give just a special shout out to the Senate pages who have joined us. I understand that around 18 out of 30 of the pages in the U.S. Senate are here tonight. We're delighted to have you here, so welcome. As well as thank you to each of you for making it out. It is never fun or easy to fight rush hour traffic, and we are delighted and honored that you are here with us tonight. We also know there are many people who want to be here tonight but could not make it. So if you have friends who are among that number, fear not, we are live streaming tonight's event. You can let them know right now, and we'll also have video up on our website and our YouTube channel before long, along with photos and clips on Facebook. I will also be live tweeting the event tonight at TTF tonight, as well as #identity and dignity, so you can follow along there as well. It's also a pleasure to see so many new faces in the audience. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature that explore the enduring questions of life and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as sponsoring programs like this one tonight to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders and engaging those big questions of life, and ultimately coming to better know the author of the answers. As we've noted at evening conversations before, it's been said that the big questions of life essentially boil down to three. What is a good person? What is the good life? And what is the just society? And wrestling with each of those questions is profoundly influenced by our sense of identity, on what we base our sense of personhood, individuality, and dignity, and the obligations, commitments, and relationships that flow from that understanding. For much of history, the constraints of everyday existence largely defined one's identity. One was born into the village where one was likely to die, performed the same work and worshiped in the same way as one's parents and relatives, married someone chosen by your family, knew the same people throughout your life. Choice was limited, but one's sense of self was given and uncomplicated. Technology, economic opportunity, and the freedoms that attend liberal democracy have opened up extraordinary choices, opportunities, and options for all of us, such that our sense of identity is no longer fixed, but open and often fluid. And as our mobility and autonomy grows, the power and the influence of some of the institutions over us, and historically, particularly the institutions of moral and religious authority, the mediating institutions of civil society, have in some ways waned in their authority or their influence. The commitments, obligations, and relationships that once bonded us to each other and helped define who and whose we are have weakened. For many, the disappearance of strong communities, moral authorities, and stable institutions has led not to a blissful freedom, but a profound sense of alienation. Such isolation has in turn fueled on an individual level a search to be part of a group, and on a societal level, a marked increase in populism and tribalism, as various identity groups seek recognition, influence, and power. In his provocative new book, our speaker tonight argues that tribalism and identity politics that has arisen for our quest for dignity and respect is actually undermining the stability of the liberal democratic order that makes human rights, religious freedom, and freedom in general possible. The increasing politicization of our identities and the inevitable resentment that follows if we perceive our own identities to be dissed lends itself to an apocalyptic politics where compromise is seen as an attack on self-worth and accommodation as self-negation. So, is it possible to construct or to recover a sense of individual identity that recognizes and grounds our identity in something other than tribalism, shared interests or resentments, or ethno-nationalism? And can we cultivate a shared identity built around common ideals, a faith that encompasses an inclusive and unifying vision of what it means to be an American? These are important questions and challenging ones, and it's hard to imagine a scholar who can engage them with more intellectual courage, thoughtfulness, and sober wisdom than our speaker tonight, Dr. Francis Fukuyama. Francis is a political scientist, a political economist, and best-selling author who also serves as the Distinguished Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, as well as the Moss-Mocker Director of its Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He previously taught at the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, as well as the George Mason University School of Public Policy, served as a researcher at the RAND Corporation as the Deputy Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff. And in addition to his latest book, which we've invited him to address tonight, he is the author of Political Order and Political Decay, The Origins of Political Order, perhaps his most famous, The End of History and the Last Man, Trust, and America at the Crossroads. He's a council member of the International Forum for Democratic Studies, a fellow of the World Academy for the Arts and Sciences, an advisory council member of the Democracy Fund, and an alumni of Harvard University, where he received his PhD. After Dr. Fukuyama's talk, responding to him will be Ryan Streeter. Ryan is the Director of Economic Policy Studies at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, previously serving as the Executive Director at the Center for Politics and Governments at UT Austin, as well as serving as a Special Assistant to the President for Policy for President George W. Bush and a policy advisor for Mayor Stephen Goldsmith in Indianapolis. He's the author of Transforming Charity Towards a Results-Oriented Social Sector, the editor of Religion and Public Square in the 21st Century, and the co-author of The Soul of Civil Society, and has been widely published in publications such as The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Weekly Standard, and National Review. Directly after Frank's talk, Ryan will offer a brief response, which will be followed by a moderated conversation between our two speakers. Frank, welcome.
So thank you, Sherry, for that excessively generous introduction, and thanks to ISI and to the Trinity Forum for having me here. I'm astonished at the crowd tonight, and I'm really glad that there's so many young faces in it. So thank you all for appearing. So let me get right into the book. So quite honestly, the reason that I wrote this book had to do with the elections of 2016, the British vote to leave the European Union, the Brexit vote, and Donald Trump's election in November of 2016. I think that both of these events are connected to a broader series of developments around the world, which are oftentimes referred to as the rise of a kind of global populism, in which you have democratic leaders that are legitimately elected, but they pursue policies that are oftentimes economically populist, but more importantly, I believe, weaken the institutional basis for modern democracy. Democracy is not simply a matter of elections, it is a matter of a rule of law, the checks and balances, the constitutional constraints that limit executive power in a well-functioning democracy. And in places like Hungary and Poland and Turkey, you've had elected leaders that have gutted their judiciaries, eliminated any kind of hostile opposition press that would hold them accountable, weakened their impersonal bureaucracies, and basically cleared away obstacles to their own kind of personal rule. I hate to report that I believe something like that is afoot in the United States as well, where we do have a president that seems to not appreciate the importance of some of these check and balance institutions and has been doing a lot, I think, in a similar vein to weaken them. And so this, I think, represents a broader movement, and what I've been trying to do over the last couple of years is to really understand the sources of this populism and why we are in this current situation. So the usual explanation is an economic one, where globalization is seen, properly to have vastly expanded the output of goods and services in the global economy. Everybody has gotten a lot richer, but that wealth has not been evenly distributed. I think anyone that takes a basic trade theory course would understand that although everybody gets richer in the world, not every individual in every country gets richer, and in particular, less educated workers in rich countries have been losing employment and opportunities to rising middle classes in places like China, India, Bangladesh, and so forth. And so there's been a stagnation in middle class wages in the United States, in Britain, in other developed countries, basically no increases in per capita income really for a very extended period of time. And that obviously has generated a lot of backlash and unhappiness and a feeling that the elites that were responsible for creating this liberal world order are very much out of touch. However, the subject of my book is not that, because I think that actually there is a cultural and identity dimension to what has happened that oftentimes is not appreciated as one of the drivers of this. So what is identity? This is a word that only came into use with the psychologist Erik Erikson in the 1950s, and the term identity politics really only came into circulation really in the 70s, 80s, 90s, associated with a certain type of politics in developed democracies like that of the United States. But as I try to explain in the book, this is actually not a recent phenomenon, and that it's very deeply embedded in the Western tradition. I actually go back all the way to Plato, where in the Republic in Book 4, Socrates says, okay, what's a human being? There is a desiring part that wants things. There's a calculating, rational part. But isn't there another part that he labels thumos, which is sometimes, it's a Greek word that's sometimes translated as spiritedness. And this part of the soul demands recognition of one's inherent dignity, that we, in addition to food and drink, want other people to respect us, to value us at a certain rate, and if we don't get that recognition, we get angry. And actually, because it is recognition, it is inherently political. It draws us into the public square because we want other people to recognize us. And so this is an old concept. I think in the modern world, it has developed in different ways because the concept of dignity is shifted. For Plato, dignity only was due to warriors, to an aristocratic class that risked their lives. But in the course of the development of Western civilization, I think Christianity actually played a very important role in shifting the concept of dignity, not to a certain limited class of warriors, but to all human beings insofar as they have the capacity for moral choice. It is the human moral agency that stands at the root of Christian dignity and becomes a universal characteristic. And so if you ask, well, why would anyone think that all human beings are equal? They're equal in this capacity for moral choice. And so as the centuries go by, this idea, the seed of this idea that we have an equal dignity insofar as we are equally free to choose takes a secular form in the writings of writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Immanuel Kant, other German idealists. I believe that it is actually at the basis of modern human rights and our understanding of rights, as defined in the American Constitution. In what sense does Thomas Jefferson, assert that all men are created equal? It really does have to do with the fact that we are equal agents and therefore equally entitled to participate in the process of self-government. Now, in that sense, I guess the final component of the modern sense of identity is that we deeply believe that we have a self that is inside us, and that doesn't necessarily correspond to the external social world. The external social world actually may despise us or not recognize us, and the modern aspect of this is that we believe that authentic inner self is morally more valuable than the social rules that look down on us, and that between the authentic inner self and those external rules, it's the external rules that have to change. And that leads you into a kind of revolutionary understanding of the relationship between individuals and the surrounding society. All right? So that's the basic kind of the theoretical background, but it manifests itself in politics in many ways. It is the basis for the drive for democracy. Democracy is about this universal respect for the personhood and the agency of the citizens of the democracy that make up the democracy. In 2011, there was a vegetable seller named Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia who had a vegetable cart that was confiscated by the police. He went to the governor's office. He said, "Can I have my cart back?" Nobody would even talk to him, so he doused himself in gasoline, killed himself, and that is what triggered the Arab Spring. It triggered the Arab Spring because throughout that region, the people that lived in these dictatorships identified with his situation. The government was so unwilling to even give him an answer. They could have said, well, you did something illegal, that's why we took your cart. They wouldn't even give him the minimum amount of respect that a human being deserves. And they said, that's basically the condition of all of us. In Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in all of these other countries, we live in governments that do not recognize our personhood. And a lot of the color revolutions that have occurred in Georgia, in Ukraine, in other parts of the world against dictatorship, there was a revolution of dignity that took place in Ukraine in 2013-14. The word dignity was important because the young Ukrainians that were out in the streets protesting against Viktor Yanukovych did not want to be dragged back into this kleptocratic Russian system where you had to be kind of personally connected to the rulers if you were going to get ahead. They wanted to live in a modern society like that of the European Union that would recognize people on a more impersonal basis. So dignity, it's not like this is a weird cultural practice for just certain kinds of cultures or regions. This is really at the basis of our democracy. Our democracy recognizes us by giving us rights. It gives us a right to speech, to association, to religious belief, and ultimately to the exercise of agency through the vote, through the franchise. And that's the respect in which we are recognized as equal individuals in a democratic society. The problem is that kind of universal recognition that is the basis of a liberal democracy oftentimes isn't enough for everybody. And particularly when you can take democracy for granted, you begin to seek other forms of recognition. The first alternative to this liberal universal form of recognition was nationalism. A nationalist believes that he or she is a member of a cultural community that should be represented in politics. All of the Germans living across Central and Eastern Europe ought to be unified under a single German government, or the Serbs living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a right to their own republic, and it is that pressure to change boundaries based on this assertion of group identity that drove the conflicts that ultimately resulted in the world wars of the first half of the 20th century. My own view is that a lot of the young men that go off to fight for the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in the Middle East are actually not driven by genuine religious piety. What they're driven by is an identity problem, especially those European Muslims who have rejected the traditional Islam of their parents and grandparents, but they're really not fully accepted by the European society where they're living in Rotterdam or in Paris or wherever. And then a Muslim preacher comes along, a Baghdadi or an Osama bin Laden, and says, you are a member of an ummah, a Muslim community that is great and glorious, has a great history. It is being oppressed. Muslims are being killed and disregarded all around the world. You need to have agency by coming, to Syria to fight back, right? And that's why they grow a long beard, pick up an AK-47, and engage in that kind of violent conflict. And so these are two examples of identity that lead to very bad political results. They lead to violence. And so identity not only drives democracy, but it also drives these forms of politics. All right, now we get to what's going on in liberal democracies. And so if you think about the United States, and now this is the more common use of the word identity, but I want to point out that this concept is very broad, and it really does apply to a lot of the stuff that's going on outside the United States and other countries around the world, this assertion of identity, all right? So in the United States, I think the history of this runs roughly as follows, that in the 1960s, you saw the rise of a number of very important social movements. It begins with the civil rights movement for African Americans, the feminist movement, the LGBT movement, the movement on behalf of the disabled, Native Americans. All of these groups had in fact become or were invisible to mainstream American society. They were disregarded, their rights were not respected. In some cases, with African Americans, their rights were actually legally subordinated to those of white people. And what they demanded was equality. They demanded an equality of respect. And so identity politics in America begins with a very just and important striving for equality, and especially this equality of respect. And I think if you look at the history of the Democratic Party in the United States, and also of a lot of the parties on the left in Europe, there is a transformation in the way that they see themselves and in the way they see their project, because earlier it had been focused very heavily on the working class. In Europe, a lot of those parties were Marxists, and so they cared about the proletariat and proletarian revolution and so forth. But they were seeking, as their main political base, this broad working class, most of whom were members of the dominant ethnic group in their society. And that was true of the Democratic Party as well, where 80% of rural whites in the South voted for Roosevelt in the 1936 election. As the left began to shift towards this more identity-based coalition based on the specific grievances of particular groups, a lot of these white working class voters began to drift over and vote for conservative parties. And so this has been a shift that's been going on in the United States for some time. In Europe, a lot of former communist voters in France now vote for the National Front for similar sorts of reasons, because the left has seen itself located in this identity space where they feel that they don't have a role. Now, this is the part that gets a little bit tricky, because I want to be very careful to say that the impulse leading to identity politics is a matter of justice. It is a perfectly legitimate thing for groups that are treated badly because they are members of groups to push back against that. And the injustice suffered by African Americans and women and gays and lesbians and all of these other groups, it's not the same. Their lived experiences are different, and therefore the remedies are going to be different. And so that aspect of it becomes, I think is understandable and a kind of natural outcome. I think that where identity politics has gone off the rails comes in a couple of different areas. When the group begins to emphasize the ways that it is different as opposed to the ways that it is similar and simply wants to join the larger community, that poses a problem, because not every group identity is necessarily compatible with the kind of universal values on which a liberal democracy is based. I mean, this is the most serious, I think, in a lot of European countries where you have Muslim groups that, express homophobia, anti-Semitism, subordination of women, these sorts of cultural values that are really not compatible with the kind of individual agency that we believe, people in a modern democracy deserve. It becomes, problematic when a given characteristic with which you're born comes to define the way you'll think about politics, about culture, even about sports and things like that, because in fact the premise of a democracy is that we are individuals that can make up our minds about, important public policy issues, and we should not be limited by simply the conditions of our birth. And, quite frankly, I think that the identity politics as it evolved on the left has now stimulated an identity politics on the right. And some of the more extreme versions of this in the alt-right and white nationalism and so forth, again, I'm sorry to say, but I believe abetted by our president, has not been healthy for the United States, because a lot of those people would like to drag the United States back into a more ethnic understanding of American identity, which is something that I had actually thought we had gotten past, in the period in the wake of the civil rights movement. So, so in general, I think that we have a little bit of this disease that afflicts other countries around the world, where people are not disagreeing over, policy issues, higher taxes or, more regulation, less regulation, whatever. They are lining up with these identity groups into which they're born, and that makes democracy, much harder to sustain. The solution to this we can talk about in our discussion, further, but I think there is a clear set of things that can be done. One of them really has to do with a focus on national identity. So national identity is oftentimes disparaged because it is associated with the kind of out-of-control, aggressive ethno-nationalism of the early 20th century. But national identity does not have to be that, and it can be something that I've labeled creedal identity, meaning that it is based on a set of ideas. And in fact, I think that the way that American national identity evolved had gotten to that point by the end of the civil rights era, where what it meant to be an American is not to be of a certain race or ethnicity or religion. What it means to be an American is to believe in the US Constitution, in the rule of law, in the principle of equality embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And if you signed up to those beliefs, it didn't matter where you came from, you would be considered an American. And conversely, if you don't like those principles, you can be un-American in a way that you can't be un-German or un-Japanese or un-something where the identity is really based on, on your ethnicity, all right? And so that's an important achievement, and I think that we need to emphasize that. So I think that the specific identities will continue to assert themselves, but I do think that we need to focus on rebuilding a sense of national identity that is creedal, based on these ideas that are accessible to the diverse, de facto diverse society that we live in today, and that we need to emphasize those integrative aspects of identity. And that's the nice thing about identity. It doesn't have to be fixed. It doesn't have to be based on biology. It can be shaped by leaders. It can be shaped by schools, by education, by the way we talk about our shared history and our shared values. And I think that's an important task that lies ahead of us. Civic education, I think, is appallingly underdone in our school system. If you look at the statistics on, the number of graduating high school seniors that can name the 3 branches of government, or can name even one of the Bill of Rights, one of the rights that's guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, it's really shocking. And you're not going to defend constitutional government if you start out with that kind of a knowledge base. There are other things I think we can say about, immigration policy. I've got lots of opinions about that, because that's really the policy issue that is the most neuralgic in terms of these identity issues, because people feel that, with the high level of immigration that has been taking place, that in a sense national identity is being changed in ways over which we really don't have control. But I'll save that for the discussion. So I'm sorry I went on longer than I was supposed to, but thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the commentary.
Well, thank you for those words and the provocation that they are. We look forward to the discussion to follow. And thank you to the Trinity Forum and ISI for organizing this, two organizations that I've had a long admiration for and have participated in a number of your events, and they're always great. So thank you for having me. For those of you who don't know much about me, I'm the person about whom you said, and some guy's responding, when you got the email that Francis Fukuyama was coming to speak at the National Press Club. So it's great to be with you. This topic of identity is one that, in general, has been of interest to me for a long time, and I've wondered for a long time why it is that we all walk around with names we didn't choose for ourselves, but that we're defensive of. If someone ever makes fun of our names, our parents chose our names, and sometimes you might even have bad memories of your parents or not even get along with your parents very well, but if someone actually says something negative about your name, you're kind of defensive about that. And there's this way in which we get enraptured by our local sports teams. If you've got your favorite football, hockey, baseball team, you can be in a funk for an entire day when they lose in the playoffs. But nobody on that team even knows you. They don't even know that you're in a funk, and yet you have this sense of attachment to this community that's very strong. And it's something fundamental. It's something very fundamental to who we are as human beings, that we have this deep sense of connection to communities, and that our identities are wrapped up in those communities. And that's the first of 2 points that I wanted to bring up in response to Dr. Fukuyama's remarks and to his book. This sociological phenomenon of our tribalistic predispositions, which I think is creating this framework within which our identity politics are becoming so divisive and poisonous today. Now, as Dr. Fukuyama said, identity politics are not all bad. We've experienced changes in workplace behavior. We've experienced changes in the way policing is done, many of which flow from responses to this call and cry for justice and to respect the inherent dignity of specific groups of people. But I think what's especially damaging today is the way in which our identity politics has become tribal. We're really more joiners than we are splitters. And we join these abstract tribes in ways that today I think are particularly threatening for the ongoing project of American democracy. It's the proliferation of abstract tribalism that I wanted to talk about for just a little bit here and then think about what to do about it. In 1752, the Scottish philosopher David Hume wrote an essay in which he talked about this emergence in modern times, he said, about politics of principle, parties of principle, in contrast to parties of interest. If you're in a seafaring town or out in a farm, your politics are very much rooted in the way of life that you have. But he noticed this thing going on in modern politics that he called parties of principle. He didn't have the term ideology. He was probably speaking of the word principle more in those terms. But he noted that the way in which emotions were stirred by abstract ideals and abstract ideas was something that was particularly powerful. We'll go join a march on the mall, but we won't go show up at the local city hall hearing on fixing potholes, even though we know we're going to be bouncing across those potholes the very next morning. This is something unique to our nature, and when we're given an opportunity to find solidarity with people over something that's a very narrowly defined identity or principle, it can cause great passionate responses within us. A little under 200 years after that, George Orwell wrote an essay called On Nationalism. And he says it's an imperfect word, nationalism, for this phenomenon that he wanted to describe as a habit of assuming that whole blocks of millions of people can confidently be labeled good and bad, and the habit of placing one's group beyond good and evil and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. This habit of what he called nationalism, but he was really describing tribalism in this essay, was marked by certain things like obsession. Any criticism or slur against your group provoked a vigorous and even sometimes violent and forceful response. And indifference to reality, in that what might be outrageous acts by others are forgiven within your own group or not even considered to be outrageous when they're committed by our side. So identity politics has generated a certain type of crisis of attachment that I think seems to be at a point where we'll see it continue in a pace, if this theory is right, which is that the more our fundamental tribes of family, household, community break down and are under strain and are shifting, the desire to join more abstract tribes is all the more powerful. We can talk about that a little bit more in the question and answer time or the discussion time. But I think if these trends that we've seen, and I won't go through the numbers in the social science now, of increasing family instability, civic fabric tearing apart, communities collapsing in terms of their civic health, it should be no surprise, as the social commentator Mary Eberstadt wrote about a year ago, that we've seen this rise in identity politics when people's fundamental attachments become confusing or even begin to dissolve. But I also want to say that when we look down at the street level, we can see that not all hope is lost, and therein might actually be part of the solution to our problem. Now, while as Pew and others have documented over the years this increase in polarization that we've seen, I mean, something to the effect of 50% of parents now would have a hard time if their son or daughter married someone from another political party, where it was 5%, I think, 50 years ago. We realize we have these strong forces of polarization, some of which we understand, many of which we don't. But I think there's also some evidence that at the local level, engagement within our communities, engagement where we're living out and expressing the American project at the local level has some promise. I'll let you consider some of the following not yet released data that some colleagues and I at the American Enterprise Institute have from a survey we just completed of 2,400 Americans. When you ask people where they get a strong sense of community in America, we ask them if they have some sense of community and a strong sense of community. When we ask people where they have a strong sense of community, 31% of them said they have a strong sense of community as Americans in their American identity, compared to just 16% who felt that way about their political in-group, and 17% in terms of their ethnicity. So even the sense that you have community with fellow Americans because they are Americans is still something that is alive and well out there. 25% of people said their city gave them a strong sense of community, and for people who regularly do attend a house of worship, 46% of those people said strong sense of community came from that house of worship. Our survey, much like others, found that between 66 and 80% of Americans of all stripes, race, age, income, education, it doesn't matter how you slice it, pretty much between 2/3 and 80% of all people think that their local community is going in the right direction, while about 40% of the people think that the country is. And 3 in 10 Americans say that they have actually worked together with the neighbors that they actually have, their physical neighbors in their community, to try to solve a problem or to make an improvement in the community. 3 out of 10 is not bad. And so I think these data suggest that part of the solution is close to home. As much as we can promote service, and perhaps even require it at times, in our schools, in our programs, and in our policies, the more the big issues like racism and inequality can become community issues that we all have a stake in overcoming. And I think at the level of policy, we've learned over the last 20 years through reforms in community policing and the proliferation of charter schools, reforms to public housing and even welfare, that when communities take responsibility for fixing big problems, they actually can do it. Not without friction and not always perfectly, but as communities and not as abstract identities. It's been too long since we've thought long and hard about the bedrock of civic life and its role to play here. So I think that's an important area for us to talk about as we think about this issue of our tribal identities versus our actual identities and communities. How do you take the latter to essentially either weaken or moderate properly the former? But even if we build on this strength at the local level and shift our identities there, we're still beset by something that is deeply disquieting. And this is my second point that I'll make quickly before we sit down. And that is a pervasive and I think even dangerous epistemological crisis that we have, a loss of confidence in transcendence on questions of human nature and what is the best society. And transcendence, very simply, it's those things that are true, whether we care about that or not. Not only in terms of the truth, I'm not just speaking about truth grounded in faith claims, religious faith claims, but transcendence in the sense of things that are true, that are the basis of our rights, and properly understanding what human flourishing actually is. Identity politics is rooted in power and interest. Remember what Orwell said. It's not about truth. It's about advancing power and interests of a specific group. Belief in truth that is real and discoverable is really an important thing for a lot of reasons. It has some actually very, very real benefits. There's some evidence that when you're motivated by truth claims that are rooted in a transcendent view of the world, that you have a tolerance for other people who are different than you. Just this week, Emily Eakins at the Cato Institute released a survey of religious conservative voters and secular conservative voters, and found that religious conservative voters are much more tolerant of immigrants and racial minorities, and that the white identitarianism that we see is very much a phenomenon of secular conservatives. And as we know, they form a very strong basis of the president's support. Another benefit to transcendence's role in society is an openness to opposing ideas. There's a body of social science work on scientific curiosity. People that are legitimately interested in exploring what is true about the nature of things are going to be much more open to debate, disagreement, and talking with people who don't actually share their views and who disagree with them. Generosity is related to transcendence. We know that religious people give more and they give more frequently, but so do people that just have an experience of awe and elevation that comes with discovering something true or seeing and witnessing morally noble actions. I don't know how you recover a culture of embracing the pursuit of truth without some kind of massive renewal of, even in some modernized form, of the liberal arts approach to education. And Dr. Fukuyama talked about the need for more civic education, and I would go even a step further and say I think we have to recognize there's been a certain cratering of our understanding of how we actually inculcate, train, and pass on these things that are actually true about our democratic way of life and what we need in order to be successful. We need more than engineers and the hard sciences to believe in truth. We need people in the humanities and we need people in the social sciences who do too. Buildings and bridges can fall down if you don't take truth claims seriously. If a school of Derridian engineering thought came about, you wouldn't trust the buildings and the bridges, but civilizations and societies can collapse too. Both of these areas require an understanding of what is true and what is good about them. This probably also means taking back primary schools to these fundamental tasks as well. It's been a generation since Allen Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind, and so the students that were on campus when he was writing are now running things, including our schools. And perhaps there's an opportunity here for social entrepreneurs to actually do this at the household level, to help parents and families explore the basic concepts like natural rights and natural law through new tools and new types of products. And finally, religious renewal away from therapeutic models of conveying theology, and certainly away from politicized theology. And perhaps back to a catechismic model of educating the laity might also not be a bad thing to do. I don't know if we can pull any or all of these things off, but I do think we should try. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Frank and Ryan. That was great fun. We have a lot of ground to cover here. We want to make sure that we have a lot of time for audience questions as well. So starting out just from a 20,000-foot view, Frank, you mentioned that the rise of identity politics is not limited to the United States, that we have seen that as well as the growth of illiberalism in different troubled democracies really around the world. So what is it that has prompted the shift away from economics to identity politics in the first place? And secondly, why the shift towards illiberalism when it's been liberal democracy that has done the most to expand recognition of previously disenfranchised groups?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that the economic explanation is part of it. If you look at who votes for populist parties, not just in the United States, but across Europe, they have a very similar demographic. They tend to be older, more rural, less educated, not part of this cosmopolitan, globalized, economy that's done extremely well in recent years. Those are the people that vote for Erdogan in Turkey, vote for Putin in Russia, they vote for Orban in Hungary. Part of it is, I think, just political opportunism, that Orban saw this opportunity by appealing to his definition of Hungarian national identity is you have to be an ethnic Hungarian, which is a very problematic way of defining national identity, but you know, he can get a very firm political base by doing that because there are a lot of ethnic Hungarians in Hungary, and by the way, he's also enfranchised all the ones that live outside of Hungary as well. And so, you know, part of it is just, you know, the rise of these kinds of political opportunists. So, and then I think it is part of this larger pushback against the kind of world that our liberal global institutions have created, where, you know, those people have not benefited enough and they're resentful of the fact that it's passing them by.
Ryan, anything to add?
Not to that.
Okay, well, we'll go to you. You've studied community and civil society for most of your career. And certainly both preceding and accelerating the rise of identity politics has been the decline of embodied, in-person community. What do you blame that on? Why has community and civil society so tanked? And are there any signs of hope that you see?
That's a great question. I think we're still trying to understand why it's been tanking, because it hasn't tanked everywhere. You know, as we've seen from a number of different scholars out there, including my own colleague at AEI, Charles Murray, it's tanked very unevenly. And so in communities with high proportions of college-educated people, dual income households, higher incomes in general, you have a lot more engagement in community still. There's a lot more participation at the community level. And it's really the kind of upper 20% of America that looks a lot more like the 1950s sort of America that we like to remember in idealistic terms. And so it's been very uneven. And so you've had in some of these places where the rise of populism has been starkest are in these areas where you've seen a collapse of confidence in civic institutions, a non-attendance of religious institutions. And I mentioned that survey that just came out this week, which shows that that's precisely the secular whites in these working class communities are the ones they actually aren't going to church. They're not involved in their communities. And they are the ones who are most sort of susceptible to this kind of nationalism that's been spreading and ascendant. And I think that is a really difficult challenge for us. And I think culturally, it's going to be difficult to turn that around if you're not going to see some kind of bottom-up renewal from within communities. As a matter of policy, I think we're at a point where we need to help people relocate to other communities. There's some evidence that when you do this, that people start to actually take on the habits and characteristics of the community where they go, and that might sound radical, but instead of trying to renew a dying community from within, it might actually make more sense for us to try to help people move around more. I think that's one of the things that we have to think about. But there has been this. It's been a long time in happening. It's kind of a secular decline of just participation in local community institutions, faith-based organizations, particularly by people kind of midway and down on the economic spectrum that doesn't seem to have any forces within it for self-correction.
You know, Shara, I mean, coming from Silicon Valley, I would have to say that technology has probably played an important role in this because, you know, there's this long debate that was set off by Bob Putnam as to whether, you know, community was really, we're all bowling alone and community was dying. And I think that as I read the empirical evidence in the wake of that debate, it's actually stronger than ever. It's just that it's occurring not in these face-to-face meetings in small towns and on front porches. A lot of it has moved online. But unfortunately, the nature of social media is such that it actually, I mean, it's perfectly made for identity politics, right? You've got some crackpot conspiracy theory about how the United States works, and if you go online, you can find the 100 other people in the country that actually believe that along with you, and you can completely shut out any contrary, evidence. And that's what, Facebook and Twitter and all of these technologies, I think, have brought us to. And so one of the issues is actually how you deal with that. I think that we've now come very rapidly in the last 12 months in regarding these as heroes of, modern life to being villains. And I don't think they're actually either, but it is a problem we're going to have to deal with.
Well, let's talk about that, because Ryan, one of the points you raised was that actually things seem to go much better on the local and embodied level than at the abstract national and international level. But of course, all of our technology is moving us towards, as you say, towards more virtual, more disembodied kinds of communication.
Yeah.
And with the rise of social media, I think Twitter came around in 2006, Facebook a few years earlier. It's amazing how much that has changed in-person communication, diminished in person, made it much more virtual. What hope, if any, do you see for that?
Well, I agree with everything that you just said, and I think that we don't even fully understand what all these forces will do to us longer term. I mean, we're seeing some interesting research coming out right now just on the iGen generation and the amount of screen time and the amount of use of social media and its direct relationship to things like anxiety and depression and some of these behavioral mood disorders. And so those are going to be with us for some time, particularly when more and more young people are experiencing this at a younger age. I would also say that we are all on various digital platforms. We all use this technology, but not everybody's behavior at the local level or the lack of participation in their communities, governments, and in the local civil society is collapsing the same way. And so strong families still matter. Religious institutions actually still matter. These fundamental institutions are the places within which we learn to practice the kinds of things that our civil society and our democratic way of life actually need. And so you can actually be on Facebook a lot and be tweeting a lot. You can be tweeting really nasty stuff and participating in the fight, and yet still go to your kid's school and help out that afternoon. And people are doing that. And I think the data that I was citing when we come out with this study, which we'll probably come out with, I think in about a month, the first one, it'll be a series, I think you'll start to see some of that. It's very much like we've seen this long-term decline since the 80s of confidence in the federal government, and behind that, the state governments as well. People's confidence in their local government is just about the same as it was in 1970. Like 75% of Americans basically think their local government's okay. Does that mean local governments are like less prone to graft and corruption and they're more transparent? No, but there's a proximity to that. Mm-hmm. And so if you are embedded within functioning institutions that you can actually affect and work through and make change, people are still doing that, even if they're spending 3 hours of their day shouting at people on Twitter. So I think that I totally agree that social media makes this identity politics thing so much easier, and it makes it so much worse. But there are these other fundamental aspects of our democratic and communal life that I think are also driving some of the dissolution that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Francis, in your book, you wrote that the rise of the therapeutic model midwifed the birth of modern identity politics. Ryan, I know that you mentioned the therapeutic model as well. And it is rather uncanny when you think about how radically different that approach towards an understanding of man is than even, say, an Orthodox Christian view of man, which is basically grounded in dignity from the Imago Dei, stamped on us. At the same time, the doctrine of original sin, the idea that we are bent by selfishness, in need of both love and forgiveness, but checks on pride and power. In contrast, the therapeutic model, as you spelled out in your book, kind of comes more from Rousseau, the idea that actually we're inherently good, we need to be liberated from societal constraints, and free to self-actualize. Is the therapeutic model compatible with the sustaining of liberal democracy? If so, how? And if not, what then do we do?
So the decline of a shared religious moral horizon is related to the rise of the therapeutic model. So, the fundamental text in this line of literature is Philip Ree's book in the late 60s, The Rise of the Therapeutic Society. That's exactly what he said. He said that, previously you went to a priest or a pastor, for counseling about anxieties that you had about your marriage, about your job, about the way you dealt with your neighbors and so forth. And with the decline of, formal religion playing that kind of a role, people then turned to psychoanalysts and psychologists. And the state itself took on a therapeutic role. And in this respect, self-esteem, became the central issue, that the goal of a therapeutic society is to raise people's self-esteem. There's an inherent contradiction in that therapeutic mission, though, because if everybody actually has esteem, then nobody has esteem, because esteem actually is due to certain things that are estimable, and the premise of therapy is that everybody should have it because everybody should feel good about themselves. And so you get into, that's why in high school graduations everybody gets an award for being the best of something, because that's what's going to make them feel good. And I think it's had this I actually had a whole chapter on Stanford University in this regard, but I didn't put it in the book in the end. But there's a quotation, so in 1980, I believe 86, Jesse Jackson came to Stanford, to try to get rid of the Western culture core requirement, and there's a quotation from the leader, the Black Student Union leader that was, pushing for this, and he said something very revealing, which is that, I understand my professors think that Plato and Rousseau and all these people are important, but they don't understand how that hurts the mentality of people that, aren't of that race and background. And what was interesting was, in a sense, universities have taken that to heart, that they've displaced an educational mission with a therapeutic mission, and so their main interest is actually in making sure that the esteem of none of the groups that have reason to feel disrespected is damaged, and that leads them to make decisions about curriculum and so forth that actually don't have any educational justification, but they do have a therapeutic justification. Now, can a society in general survive this shift out of a religious framework? Well, I hate to say, but yes, I think it can. And I would simply point to Europe. If Europe has become the most secular society probably in human history, and it's much more orderly than the United States, and it has good democratic institutions. And so I've always been very skeptical about these arguments that you actually have to have a certain kind of religious foundation to actually maintain basic social order, because I can think, it's not just Europe, but I can think of other, Asia really doesn't have religion in anything like a Western sense, and they have very orderly societies. So I think that, that decline you can survive. The therapeutic bent, though, I think is tricky, because it really does shift the discussion away from, a kind of a discussion of what really human excellences are and ought to be, and what we really ought to esteem, and towards, just a model that says that everybody deserves it. And I think that's something that is that's a contradictory and unfulfillable goal.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, anything to add?
Well, I'll just be brief. The one thought that comes to mind is that I think it is a problem. I think the rise of the therapeutic model and the way it's expressed itself throughout our educational institutions, even in the workplace, and the way that we communicate through media is a real problem. And I think that what we probably don't talk enough about is the way in which kind of the human aspiration to fulfill potential, kind of this Aristotelian sort of model of pursuit, is really important as we're raising young people and teaching our college students and teaching our kids before then about what it actually means to try to fulfill the potential that you have, because what we do know is that happiness is really rooted in that. I think the therapeutic model doesn't have a lot of evidence going for it when it comes to the kind of happiness outcomes you get, and that is actually a fundamental objective of public policy in this country. And I think when you look at whether it's the Easterlin paradox, or you look at the other research on subjective well-being that's out there, and you see that after you add a basic level of income continues to make people happy, but these other things really start to matter: the quality of relationships in your health, and stability of institutions, and these sorts of things. And we have kind of wired within us this desire to improve ourselves. And if our educational system is not kind of built up around that notion that you're actually not where you need to be right now, but this is lifelong pursuit of earning success, of fulfilling potential, of becoming, is something that I think has been lost, and I think this therapeutic model has damaged it pretty seriously. I remember when I was teaching one of my classes in Texas that it was a public policy course, and I would do this one segment on political priors and biases, and I would have students read a variety of things, including some of Jonathan Haidt's work from The Righteous Mind, which talks about the moral languages, essentially, that progressives and conservatives speak. And I had a student say to me, I just reject that. One of Haidt's findings, and I said, what do you mean? She says, it just makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to have to deal with it. And I thought it was one of these great expressions of but I said, but there's a whole body, he ran some experiments, and this is some fairly serious research behind these findings, and it's like, it didn't matter. It was one of these great expressions of this makes me uncomfortable. I don't like what it says about people with my politics, and I'm just going to choose not to believe it. And I think that's essentially kind of where we are.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about where we go from here. Francis, you mentioned the need for a creedal identity. Mm-hmm. But as you also pointed out, civic knowledge is down. Mm-hmm. And there have even been people like Senator Ben Sasse who have said that what we really need is a new civic catechesis as a precursor to any kind of creedal identity. If you could develop a civic catechesis, what would it be?
Well, that's... it obviously would require, a certain knowledge of history, because you can't understand institutions unless you understand where they came from. It would require a certain amount of theory, because there is theory as to how constitutional government is actually supposed to work. I think actually in the current age, I would add some other stuff that wouldn't be in a traditional civic education class, because, for example, it turns out that a lot of students, including very sophisticated ones, do not know how to judge the authenticity and the authority of things that they read on the internet. And I think actually a civic skill that's become very important is developing that ability to distinguish between more and less credible sources of information. So, this is not a program I've really thought through at any great length, but I think those would be the basic components of it.
Mm-hmm. And Ryan, one of the points that you made was that you said a necessary precondition to any kind of development of a creedal identity would be the reinvigoration of a liberal arts tradition. Why is that, and what would it look like?
Well, I think there's a lot that we've used in the past that still would be good if we remained committed to it. So I think the core body of classic texts, and really at the university level, having something a little bit more like a core curriculum wouldn't be a bad thing in this regard. So there's certainly a body of knowledge, but I think a modernized approach to the liberal arts based on some of what we've learned in the social sciences as well. Part of what a liberal arts education is supposed to do is not just impart a body of knowledge, but also cultivate certain abilities and skills which allow you to lead and which allow you to participate in democratic life. And we've learned a lot more in the last 25 years about the kinds of things that develop what might be called social skills within people. When I read the social skills literature, the non-cognitive literature, the behaviors that the scholars are writing about are typically the behaviors we used to say you're supposed to develop through a liberal arts education: the ability to form arguments, the ability to analyze, the ability to make judgments, the ability to actually stand up in front of people and make an argument and be able to critique an argument, and these sorts of things, which we have new tools for actually cultivating that within people, which I think could also be used. So it's not just dusting off the great books and making people sit around and read them. There's new pedagogical methods and tools that we have now that we didn't used to, which I think would really work well.
So we're going to turn now to the most dynamic part of our evening conversation, which is hearing from you. So those of you who have been to a Trinity Forum event before know that we have 3 guidelines for questions from the audience, which is we simply ask that all questions be brief, all questions be civil, and all questions be in the form of a question. So we have our Cracker Jack interns around the room with microphones. Please just wait to be recognized. Have a microphone in front of you before going to town. Questions from the audience. Right here in the middle. Millian, maybe you could stand up so you're easier to see. Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
And wavelengths, okay. Hi, my name is Michael Smits. Thanks very much to you all for being here. I just finished the book this week, so still processing to some extent. And I recognize as well, with reference to Alan Bloom, that a lot of the language we use for talking about these sorts of ideas is itself influencing the ideas and how we understand them. It's something you recognize in your book as well, that society modifies the ideas we have, and the ideas we have then impact society in turn, that there's something cyclical at work. I had a little bit of trouble tracing this idea of identity, thumos, from Plato all the way to identity politics, the progressive movement today. You reference, look, you damn wretches, take your fill of the fair sight. This loathing of the self for looking at corpses when one knows one ought not do it. The way I understood that in Plato in the Republic, it suggests that there's something that the individual recognizes is intrinsically wrong with the behavior undertaken. Whereas I think if you follow that thread to the present day, identity politics would suggest that that which one identifies as good for oneself is the thing which is good for oneself. So my question in brief, with a question mark, is this idea that appears in Plato consonant with the present day, that our identity is that which we think it is, or is there a further identity somewhere deeper down that is who we are independently of how we think of ourselves?
Well, I think one of the characteristics of the modern concept of identity is that we think that hidden inner identity is authentic and is something real. And we may not even know exactly what it is, but we feel that it's that authentic self is the one that we morally value. It seems to me what your question is asking is, how does that relate to actually whether it is something morally valuable or not? And I have no idea how to answer that. I think that as a psychological phenomenon, you have to just understand that the structure of modern identity is this belief. I mean, this is what Charles Taylor, explicates, I think, very fully. The structure of modern identity, directly coming out of a writer like Rousseau, validates that inner self, whatever it is. For Rousseau, it's a kind of plenitude of creative, expressive feeling. It could be the inner feelings of an artist. It could be, again, our groupish, connections that we have with a folk, that we are connected to through our ethnos. So there are a lot of different forms of it, and whether that's somehow, transcendently valid or not, I don't know how to answer that question. I suspect in most cases it's not.
Ryan, anything you want to add on Plato?
No, we can move to another
great.
question.
All right, we'll go up here to the front. Who has the microphone? Nellie, maybe right here, that'd be great. Yeah, right here.
Hi there. As an Australian, part of Western civilization, from a country where we've rotated several prime ministers in a short amount of time, it's quite clear to us that what's being experienced in the UK and the US isn't inherently unique. We just experience it in a different way because I suppose our institutions might function a little differently. So my question would be, where does a country that hasn't quite ended up where the US has, where do we start to learn how to avoid this current situation, to put it lightly?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting question. Canada and Australia both have higher proportions of their population born outside of the country than the United States. The United States right now is about 15%. I think that Canada is like up to 22, 23%. Australia is maybe around 20 or so. And yet, apart from Polly Hanson, you really haven't had a serious populist movement. There's no serious populist movement in Canada right now. Now, of course, this could all change, tomorrow. But so it's an interesting question as to why that's the case. My hypothesis would be something as follows: that what's driving populism in the United States and in Europe is not simply racism, xenophobia, and the level of foreign-born people in the country, it actually has to do with other things like, for example, the degree to which the country is actually in control of its borders and the degree to which it can select the kinds of people that it is legally allowed in. Both Canada and Australia have skill-based immigration policies, and they both have very little illegal immigration. Now, Australia has gotten a lot of criticism for this because you stick all of your refugees on Nauru or Papua New Guinea, in places like that. That is not a nice way to treat refugees. On the other hand, maybe that's the explanation for why you've avoided this kind of, right-wing backlash in a country that has become really, really multicultural, very rapidly. So this is why I wanted to get into this discussion of immigration because, among other things, I think that, there's a common assumption that opposition to immigration is simply the result of, the majority population resenting the fact that, people that don't look like them are there. So it's sort of driven by basic racism and xenophobia. But what the Australian and Canadian cases suggest to me that there are other factors, some of which are more legitimate than racism. And one has to do with the fact of whether, your society is actually in control of the process. The other actually has to do with a point that I should have mentioned earlier, which is assimilation. That I think you can legitimately worry about immigration. You can legitimately worry about whether immigrants are going to be able to successfully assimilate to the national culture, assuming it's democratic, open, so on and so forth. That's a reasonable reason to worry about immigration, and that may also be a factor, that is playing into the debates in your country and elsewhere. It may explain why you have that difference and why you haven't gone down this American route.
Other questions over here. It's coming.
I'm Thomas from India on a visit. I'm so glad to have been here. A very simple question. I have the impression that we human beings tend to exaggerate. So when there is an overemphasis on economy and when you exaggerate too much, there is bound to be a cultural identity self-assertion. If it is moderate, it is respectable. If not, it is bound to come. And it's bound to exaggerate if the other exaggeration is there. What do you think, Mr. Francis?
So I think that's probably a general principle that I guess the question is how do you see it actually playing out in contemporary politics? I think that the way that I would illustrate that principle, has to do with this whole issue of political correctness, right? Because political correctness arises out of identity politics in certain ways, that you don't want to say things that are perceived as demeaning to particular identity groups, and therefore you have to be very careful about the language you use and so forth. And I think that in itself has driven a lot of people to, support someone like Donald Trump, who is, gets a lot of credit for saying what he really thinks, even if it's racist, xenophobic, hateful, spiteful, so forth. At least he's authentic. And that does seem to me a kind of case of, one form of speech actually triggering, a reaction on the other side. So I don't know whether, that's a good example of what you were trying to illustrate, but I do think that is, one of the elements that's now playing out in our politics where, that's why Trump can get away with saying all these really, I think, sort of disgraceful things, because people say, well, I may not agree with, his particular comment about women or, football players or whatnot, but at least he's saying what he really thinks, and that's something that, other politicians haven't been willing to do.
Mm-hmm. We'll go back over here, in the back there. If you could stand up so you're more visible. Right behind you.
Thank you for coming. My name's Bishop Davidson. Your grounding of dignity in some sort of Christian tradition, coming primarily out of moral agency or moral choice, I think is in part right, but you're surely aware of maybe this other alternative idea that it's grounded in imago Dei or something along what Ryan Streeter had to say in terms of transcendence. And then your conclusion on what is to be done in the end of the book regarding kind of this credo identity, is that any sort of concession to transcendence for us to get away from a place where our identities are oriented around our choices and come to a place where they're more unified behind something transcendental?
You know, I think as a realistic project, getting any kind of agreement on, transcendental grounding for identity is going to be pretty difficult. I think that, the fact of the matter is that, national identity in this country is going to have to be pretty thin because it is such a diverse country. You think about like a oil field worker in Louisiana versus a hipster waiter in San Francisco, in terms of all the things that a culture would hold in common, religion, even things like sports, dress, cuisine, all of these things are different, for these different groups in the country. And so unlike Europe, where you actually, again, they've gotten away from any understanding of transcendence, but they do have much thicker cultures based on, much deeper historical traditions of shared experience, that manifest itself in things like food and dress and, speech and so forth. We don't have that in the United States. And so any kind of creedal identity is going to have to be fairly thin gruel. It will have to be things that will be, acceptable to people that come out of really, really different religious traditions or, tradition of no religion at all. And that means that I think it has to be basically political in nature. It has to be built around certain beliefs, and we're actually going to have to shunt aside the discussion of where the grounding of those beliefs comes from, because, the natural right that Jefferson talks about in the Declaration of Independence, a lot of Americans would disagree with that. That there is that it's possible to ground things. In fact, I had a long discussion with Richard Schultz, who had been the head of Amnesty International, about universal human rights, and I just said, well, okay, in your view, where do human rights come from? What are they grounded in? And he said, well, they're basically just, they've evolved over time and they're kind of what the culture has produced. And I said, well, okay, so in China you have a culture that, doesn't believe in, our view of human rights. So does that mean that they're right also? And he said, well, no, I mean, but he didn't have any grounding for this. I mean, he could have made an argument that referred to natural right, but someone like him would not, accept an argument like that. So I just think that, unfortunately, we're never going to get agreement, on those kinds of first principles, and therefore we have to, fall back on political ideas that we can commonly accept and that allow us to live together in a kind of pragmatic way. And I also, if you can do other things, if you can add other virtues to it, I didn't mention this, but I think national service is a good idea. I think that the idea that you owe something to your society beyond paying taxes and obeying the law is a way of cultivating a sense of active citizenship. And so if we can get to that point, that would be a very good thing. But, anything beyond that gets to real first principles, I suspect we're not going to get to.
Ryan, you spoke about transcendence. Anything to add there?
Yeah, and I would just say too, because I was speaking more in generalities, to make it less sort of lofty, the idea that we have basic rights which are enshrined in law, which are rights whether we like them or not, or we think of them the same way as someone else, is an important thing. I mean, I think that, and I think we can actually recultivate an interest in these kind of enduring and permanent things without having to have discussions about the sort of ontology of them and getting theological. I think John Rawls wrote The Theory of Justice in 1971. His entire famous kind of veil of ignorance experiment that, is the most famous part of the book, wouldn't even be possible without sort of an idea that there was a universal application for this notion of justice, and that book today couldn't even really be published in this sort of an identities-fraught environment, because you can't claim to actually know what would be just for people outside of your people group. So just that understanding of justice, and I'm just picking that out as one example, is an example of some presupposed principles that are just they're just true, and they're what our institutions are based on. We should unapologetically talk about those things, and those should form the basis, I think, of a renewed civic education.
We're going to take one last question. Let's see, so many hands. We'll go right here, right in front of Nellie-Ann. Yes.
Thanks so much. My name is Ham. I'm a student at Harvard. My question deals with the current political situation in Europe. Because a lot of my friends and I often discuss this topic, that why populism and identity politics is on rise in places where socialist tradition used to be pretty strong throughout the 20th century. So this creates some extent, some confusion that why populism is on rise there.
I think it kind of depends on the country. So in a way, the strongest populist movements have been in Eastern Europe, where you really do have a lot of these kind of quasi-authoritarian, political parties and leaders in Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and so forth. And part of that is that I think that Eastern Europe went directly from communism to democracy without this kind of thoroughgoing cultural liberalization of its society. It's very ironic that they have this anti-immigrant populist, these movements, because they don't have foreigners there. The rate of immigration into these countries is almost zero. And so for them, it's a completely theoretical issue. Like they're saying to themselves, we don't want to become like the Netherlands or France, because they actually have never had this slow process of learning to live with, diverse minority populations that don't look like you. And so I think that's what's driving it there. In other parts of Europe, it's more similar, I think, to what's going on in the United States. So if you look where Marine Le Pen's National Front vote comes, very heavily in northeastern France, that's the most deindustrialized part of the country that had been the industrial, kind of heartland of France in the 19th century, and then, has gone into this long-term decline. And so there, I think these economic factors can explain a lot of the, the voting patterns.
Ryan, we'll give you the chance for the last word.
I think I agree with what Francis just said, and I think you have depending on which country you're talking about, you have very serious assimilation issues, which he referred to earlier, and this sense of identity, which is much less creedal and much more rooted in the history of the country. And so there are some places where you just really cannot assimilate very well. And then when you increase the amount of people who didn't grow up in that country there, it creates a particular backlash. And I think that's what we're seeing in stark numbers across the continent.
Great. Francis, Ryan, thank you.
Thank you.
Oops. Thank you. Oops. As we wrap up, we'll just mention that copies of Francis's book are for sale. Identity, the Demand for Dignity, and the Politics of Resentment. They'll be for sale right here. Is that where they'll be? Francis will be signing. Copies are available for $26, so we commend the work to you and encourage you to avail yourself of that opportunity. In addition, you should each have an invitation on your chair that we encourage you to avail yourself of, and that is to join the Trinity Forum Society, a small invitation that looks just like this. We at the Trinity Forum are aiming to make possible discussions such as this and offer thoughtful professionals such as you a chance to wrestle with the big questions of life in a setting that is characterized by intellectual rigor, broad curiosity, and what we hope is warm hospitality, standing athwart a distracted and divisive culture, and we encourage you to be part of a community that helps make this possible. There are, of course, many advantages to being part of this community, including a subscription to our quarterly readings, such as Václav Havel's Politics, Morality, and Civility. Many examples of our readings are also available for sale right as you exit the door, and we encourage you to avail yourself of those. In addition to our readings, you also receive our monthly podcast and our daily list of what we're reading, recommended, and curated readings. But tonight, there is a special offer for any of you. The first 10 people who join tonight, you will have a free and signed copy of Francis's book. So avoid the line, join the Trinity Forum Society. As we wrap up, it's always appropriate to end with thanks. And as you might imagine, an event like this tonight does not happen with many people to thank. So we'd like to thank, of course, our speakers for the contributions that they made. We're grateful to our co-hosts. We're so glad you could join us, Charlie and Josh, tonight, as well as members of your team. We're thrilled for the sponsorship of the Democracy Fund and Joe Goldman and his staff who are with us tonight. Thanks also to our fantastic photographer, Clay Blackmore, our volunteer, Lissy McClanahan, my fantastic colleagues, Colleen O'Malley-Horrocks, maybe you can just wave, Alyssa Abraham, and Rebecca Noyes. If you have any questions about joining as a member, about sponsoring such a program, about getting more involved with the Trinity Forum or the Trinity Forum Society, please speak to my colleagues who are enthusiastically waving over in the corner. In addition, I'd like to thank our fantastic interns, the ones running around with the microphones, Nellie Ann Rivera, Isabella Teague, and Logan Valandis. And again, thank you in particular to both Francis and Ryan for your particularly thoughtful remarks tonight. So appreciate that. And you, thank you to all of you for coming, and good night.